So I wanted to thank Frida and everybody at the Symposium, but especially Frida for inviting me. Until very recently, I was living and working in London. I'm actually in between countries and I'm moving to the south of France tomorrow, which seems very immediate. But in the meantime, I'm here. But for most of my working life, I've been in London. I'm going to flesh out that story a little bit more. When Frida first invited me to talk, she suggested that basically she wanted a sort of outsider's perspective to talk a bit about, E5 Bakehouse, which is the bakery that I've worked with for many years, which has a quite unique place in the sort of UK grain world. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about where we're at in the UK grain community as well, because I'm going to be asking you guys some questions afterwards, because I'm interested. I want to sort of use it to kind of compare to where you guys are at in Germany, and see if we can kind of learn from each other a bit, because I get the sense that obviously bread has a very long history in Germany, but perhaps in this sort of what Laurel described it as new European baking, it's the sort of bread world in Berlin is maybe not quite as fully developed as in the UK, and maybe we can question that, and that's fine too. But yeah, so sort of talking a bit about the journey that we've been on. So I would encourage you to ask questions as well. I guess I'm sort of going to talk about the story of the UK grain community and also of E5, and a bit about my story, and then we can kind of open it up to a conversation towards the end. So I guess, yeah, there are lots of different directions I could go in it, but for me, the sort of, when I was reflecting on how I would kind of bring it all together, the sort of common thread for me is community, really, and that's something that Frida and a lot of the speakers have touched on, and something that in the UK I feel quite blessed. And I'm gonna premise this by saying I'm an optimist, and I like to look at the positives. So I don't want you to think of it as like it's not all like rosy. Obviously, there's a lot of there are some negatives, and there are some crunch points, and there are difficulties as well. But I do really believe in focusing on what is positive and what is good, and I think that can be very motivating. But yeah, so community is the common thread, and by that I guess I mean the community around the dough table, which is a very for those bakers among us and those of us who bake with other bakers, that space around the table when you're just shaping dough is, while the hands are busy, it kind of frees up the mind. It's almost like going for a walk. It frees up the mind, and the conversations that come out of that can be very creative. They can be really stupid and really silly as well. But a lot of creativity and a lot of ideas come out of that space. But I also mean the community of the broader grain community and the support that can bring. And I guess I sort of see the UK grain community as a bunch of people who challenge me and challenge each other, and also question things, but are also like fundamentally sort of mutually supportive. And I'll go into more detail of what I mean by that. So I'm hoping to give you an insight into what the grain community is, and talk a little bit about our successes and failures, and then maybe we can see how they kind of weave together. So just a little bit about my background, because I didn't start E5, and in a way it's quite funny for me to be here representing E5. But I'm going to introduce you to some of the characters as we go along. But in another way, it's kind of nice because it reflects how E5 is as an organization, because it's a little bit indefinable and it's a sort of moving organism. And I'll try and explain what I mean by that. So it's quite nice that, that my story kind of interweaves and hops in and out, because that's quite E5 as well. So I began baking in 2016, and I actually have quite a long history with E5 because I opened a restaurant, and Katerina mentioned it before. I opened a restaurant about the same time as E5 Bakehouse started, so that was 2010. So I knew Ben, the owner. So that's E5 Bakehouse. That's one of the archways. Maybe I'll go back to that slide. So this is E5. This is Ben on the left. So Ben McKinnon is the founder of E5 Bakehouse, and I first met him when I first opened my little restaurant, cafe / music venue. It was very grungy. It was cute. It was like produce-led cooking. I wasn't a baker at this point, just an extremely ambitious and optimistic 23-year-old with too much energy and not enough experience. But it was a lot of fun. And so we ran that for 5 years. And I met Ben because when he first started E5, he was like cycling around East London, and he just started to bake. And he'd gone on this like 2-week sourdough baking course, and was baking these actually not very good, which is for the bakers among us. When you start baking, especially if you're self-taught, they're not that great. But he had so much energy, and he actually went to visit the cafe that my boyfriend at the time, who I then went to open the restaurant with, was working. And I even remember the day that Matt, my boyfriend at the time, came home, and he was like, yeah, this guy came round, and he had this energy, and he was like this he was like a little boy in a man's body, like so excited and so charismatic, like with just these like loaves of quite heavy, quite sour, quite dense loaves of bread, but just convinced about the value of what he was doing, and it was really infectious. So then we opened the restaurant, and his bread wasn't good enough yet. So we sort of waited a bit. We got some bread from somewhere else, and then eventually they started. We started working together, and E5 started supplying us with bread. So I was consuming the bread for a long time before actually working as a baker. So we sold the restaurant in 2015, and I continued to work as a chef for a while. And I also wrote a book at this time, and it was a sort of cookbook / memoir of the restaurant, not particularly of us. And it was a really nice sort of space and time to reflect on everything that we'd done. And it was a interesting point in the food industry in London at that time, because it was just blowing up. And what I mean by that is like it was around 2010 was the time when sort of interesting, small, independent restaurants led by creative, sort of open-minded, often quite educated, but not always, people, and sort of produce-led cooking began. And we were selling natural wine and craft beer before. I'd never even heard the term natural wine. I had worked with this producer, with this wine supplier, and he was like, "Oh, try this," and I was like, "This is amazing." So it was quite sort of DIY, like that kind of casual produce-led cooking. But we sold it because somebody offered to buy it, and we were like, okay, we sort of want to move on and do something different. But writing the book gave us an opportunity to reflect on what we'd achieved, but also what we hadn't achieved. And as a sort of young person, we'd had this super ridiculously idealistic idea that we could just open a space that everybody could come to, and we could make it cheap because we weren't interested in money. And it didn't matter if we made that much profit, because ultimately we were just there to like hang out with our friends and cook really nice food. You're laughing because you recognize this. Yeah. Cook delicious food and hang out with our friends and play music and be silly and party and, all these things. But obviously running a business is not like that at all. And although it was a success, and I consider it a success, one of the failures was that the people who came through the door were quite a specific group of people. They were basically people who looked like us. And as rents increased in London, and what sort of happened was I found that I was cooking food that I couldn't really afford to eat myself, and especially once I sold the restaurant, started working in other restaurants, my wages were not reflecting, the food that I was cooking, and so I decided to go into baking. And when people ask me why did I start baking, my normal answer is that I got bored of just feeding rich people, because the food that I wanted to cook was with good produce, and therefore it had to have a certain price. So I decided to start baking, and one of the big reasons was that even if it's the most beautiful loaf of bread made with the most expensive flour, it's still probably, it's gone up quite a bit recently, but it might be accessible for somebody, once a month, even if they're really broke, maybe, as opposed to a meal for two, which could set you back, like 70 euros, 100 euros, whatever. So, and we talked a bit in the other conversation about elitism and stuff, but ultimately I think bread has the potential to be more accessible. And it's also a really good basis for community work. So that's sort of why I decided to go into bread. And it was actually a friend of mine who was from southern Italy, who had said this thing to me, when I was in my late teens, and he was like, what's weird about England is that in Italy everybody eats the same bread. Doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. Everyone just basically eats it. It's quite rubbish. And no offense to any Italians here. It's quite rubbish in general, but everybody eats the same bread. Whereas in England, everybody eats different bread based on your class. And I recognized that as something that was annoying and weird, and it didn't make sense, and it didn't have to be like that. It's taken me a while to work out why it's like that. And now I'm still trying to work out, okay, how do we fix it? Not that I think everybody should eat the same bread, but I do think that everybody has the right to eat nutritious, delicious bread every day. And there's a way to do it. We're just we're working on it, I guess. So let me see where I am. So then I started baking at E5, and I immediately became obsessed with bread, and sort of looked around me and saw the bakers that I was working with, and were like, okay, these are my people. I was like, right, I've landed. This is where I belong. Because they nourished me, they supported me, and they challenged me, they nurtured me, and E5 especially is the kind of place where people get a job at E5 and then they do what I call the E5 flourish, where they just become more of themselves, and they become more confident, and they just sort of step into this new space, which is quite magical. So for most of my time as a baker there, I was trying to work out, okay, what's that magic, and how does that happen? So then in 2021, I decided, still during the pandemic, and I'd been the head baker of the bakers at E5 for a while, and I decided to move to Paris, where I worked at 10 Bells for a year and a half. And a lot of the reason why I went to France was to just sort of use it as a comparison, because I think France is really interesting, especially for the Brits, because the French are very similar in lots of ways, but really, really, really different from the Brits. And in their approach to food as well, there are so many differences that I think we can really learn from. And a lot of the approaches we have to bread in the UK are kind of polar opposite in France, which I'll go into a little bit more. So then, after working in Paris, I then moved back to London because one of the directors at E5 went on paternity leave, and so there was an opportunity there for me to step back into an organisation that I loved in a directorship role. So that's why I'm here, sort of speaking about E5. So I'm now going to. So that's enough. That's enough about me. I'm now going to talk a bit about the UK grain community and what kind of characterizes it, and a little bit about why I think that is, and then I'll talk about E5. So the UK grain community is, I think, very special, and I've written here a few things about what sort of characterizes it. So I think it's mutually supportive rather than competitive. I think it's based on generosity. I think it's innovative. It's quite open and playful. And I think there's a lack of judgment from the presence of a pre-existing tradition, which I'll explain a bit more. So it sounds a bit idyllic. I know, but as I said, I'm an optimist. So I think in lots of ways the UK grain world comes from a very particular position, and one of the reasons is because of sort of industrialization and the industrialization of agriculture in the UK. All, as far as I know, all the heritage wheat that anybody was growing was wiped out. So I've never come across a farmer who is still growing varieties of wheat from pre-1945 on their land in the UK. I've never come across it, and I've never heard of it either, which I think differs maybe from, well, most other countries that are wheat-growing countries, because people would commonly, even if it was super industrialized, would commonly keep back a little plot of their land just to plant the seeds that their grandparents had given them or whatever. Like there was some sense of that living history through this cultivation that people would just keeping their seeds, you know. But that doesn't really exist in the UK. So we kind of had this weird blank slate, and also we also have a weird blank slate because it's not very there aren't that many regulations around bread. So there are no regulations around what you can call sourdough, which is a huge topic in itself. So supermarkets are making bread, putting a little bit of acidity in it and calling it sourdough, as compared to the French, where the baguette, the tradition is like very specific about exactly what ingredients go into it. So there's very little regulation, which in some ways I think is kind of bad, because it means that the baseline of the bread that people were eating was hyper-industrialized, super white flour, extremely I struggle to refer to it as bread, and obviously it is, but maybe it's not bread from what a lot of you would recognize, perhaps. So in some ways, yeah, it's kind of awful, but in another way, it left this kind of crazy gap for innovation and creativity and just doing whatever you want, which is really exciting as a baker. So it was thanks to, and I'm going to point out three individuals, three sort of visionaries of the UK grain world. And the first one is this man here. This is Martin Wolf, who I had the pleasure to see speak at the UK Grain Lab, which is a bit like this, but grain-specific, sort of biannual gathering of farmers, millers, bakers in the UK. I think it was 2018 I saw him speak. He's now passed away, but he was an extremely important figure. Has anybody heard of Martin Wolf? Yeah, okay, cool. And he developed a lot of ideas around agroforestry. So, and you can see this is a perfect example. So this is on his farm called Wakelands. So it's sort of like companion plant. I mean, I'm not a farmer, so I don't know that much about agroforestry, except that here you can see that he's planted this big strip of wheat in between lines of trees. There are lots of reasons why you would do that, but mostly to do with biodiversity. And he developed what's called a population wheat, Does everybody understand what I mean by population wheat in this room, more or less? No. Okay. So most wheat in this country, in the world actually, is monocrop. So it's a single varietal of wheat. And that's a way of farming that's sort of been developed, and one sort of plant breeder historian called Ed Dickinson, who I saw speak once, said that the reason, like one of the sort of motivating factors to do that was just because farmers wanted things to be very neat and quantifiable, and to do with the combine harvester. And but as I said, I'm not a farmer, so so monocropping single varietals of wheat. A population wheat is the exact opposite in a way. So it's a lot of different varieties of wheat, all in the same field, and they are grown together. And this is how wheat would have grown historically. And there is some interbreeding, so crossbreeding. So Martin Wolf developed a population wheat called YQ, and the Y stands for yield, and the Q stands for quality. And without going into the legality of it, because I don't know, I'm not enough of an expert, but population wheats are not recognized by seed trade laws because they're not, their DNA is not definable. And that's because of its inherent diversity. The point of a population wheat is that it is diverse. But he championed this wheat called YQ, which I'm not sure how they made it recognizable, but it was definable by seed trade laws. So it was kind of a sort of groundbreaking sort of wheat that he popularized. And if you want to learn more about it, because my explanation was not particularly clear, I can come and talk to me afterwards, and I can send you a link to an article or some other things that are really will flesh it out in a much more eloquent way than I've just done. But really, really groundbreaking stuff around cereal diversity. So that's Martin Wolf. And then this is the other fella, Andy Forbes, who is the sort of, I like to think of him as the like punk guy of the grain world in the UK. He's sort of undefinable, but he's a total visionary, and he really championed the use of heritage wheats on his little allotment in South London. And here he is. This is just a few weeks ago. So Ben and the other guys on the farm, on E5's farm, planted a plot of 20 different varieties of wheat that he'd like gathered. So it was lots of little test plots. And this is them trying to work out which wheat is which, because they're both a bit disorganized. And they're like, hang on a second, is the Lebanese one here, or is this the Durham wheat? Is this so this is them trying to remember which one's which. Luckily they did remember it, and they had written it down. But a bunch of us went and hand harvested all the different varieties of wheat, which was really fun. I don't know if we've milled. I don't think we've milled any yet. I think they're probably still sitting in bunches in the polytunnel. But Andy Forbes, he's an extremely important figure who has championed heritage varieties of wheat and has also developed his own population wheats. And he is a really important kind of connecting piece. And he developed a population wheat called Miller's Choice, which it was a few years ago, he'd got a bunch of farmers to grow little plots of different types of wheat in bigger volumes than this, so they were actually usable. And E5 milled them, and then we did a whole bunch of test bakes, and it must have been about 15 different varieties of wheat. We invited loads of people, well, loads of grain nerds, because it was an extremely nerdy event, to come and taste the breads and then score them all. And that's how we decided that Miller's Choice as a population was the best one. So then Miller's Choice was bulked up, and it is now the wheat that we've been milling throughout this whole past harvest. pretty much. So we probably milled and baked maybe 50 tons of miller's choice. So to go from sort of deciding which variety of wheat to then go into quite big production is one of the sort of fun and magical parts of E5 Bakehouse. Okay. And then there's a final figure. I mean, there are definitely other figures as well, but I don't have a picture of him, of a farmer called John Letts, who's maybe some has anyone heard of John Letts? John Letts is also a very important figure. But where Andy Forbes is the punk, John Letts is like the sort of historian where everything has to be, he's very like extremely knowledgeable, but everything has to be precise. And he actually heckled me at one of these gatherings like this because I described a wheat as a heritage wheat, and he was like, no, it's a long straw, and then it was developed in 1965, and I was like, oh god. Anyway, so yeah, he's quite a character, that just as important. So it was down to these three men really, as to how we really popularized, I guess, at least within this sort of artisan bakery movement, using heritage varieties of wheat and unusual varieties of wheat, which for me as a baker is like just one of the most exciting things you can do. So now I will talk a little bit about E5. So here we've got Dan, who's one of our extremely talented bakers, teaching a class, and you can see you can sort of see. Is there another picture there? No, you can't. Oh, that's us harvesting the wheat. A bunch of the bakers. So this is the mill that we have. So when E5 started in 2010, it was, as I said, it was just Ben on his own, and then it sort of grew quite quickly, actually, and he moved into an archway in London, which was one of the first images I showed you. We now have 3 archways, and then we have another site in sort of slightly south London, which is quite different, and maybe if I have time, we'll talk about that later. And we also have a farm. So we now have 3 sites, and we employ nearly 100 people, or about 100 people at the last count. So it's big. It's really big, and we don't just do bread. With time, so bread was always the sort of the heart of it. And I think one of the sort of reasons for E5's success is that it was founded on quite strong core values. And those core values are, I guess, diversity in the field, but also encouraging diversity and celebrating diversity within people, and sustainability. And then the focus was, how do you make the most delicious bread possible? Basically, so flavor-led. And so over time it's grown hugely, and we now we make beans bar chocolate, we roast our own coffee, we have a breakfast, lunch, we do supper clubs, we have a cafe, we have a deli shop, we teach, we do a lot of teaching. What else do we do? And we mill, and it was the mill really that led us on the farming journey. Oh, what's the other one? Oh yeah, we also planted some vines, but that's one of the not yet successful, but might be successful one day, but might not be successful stories of E5 Bakehouse. And the mill is kind of actually, I'm going to switch back to this one. So it's right in the center of the bakery, really, and it's kind of like there. You can sort of see it. It's a French mill called an Astrier mill, and one of the things that we sort of learned on our quest to make the most delicious, simplest sourdough was that actually the fresher the flour, the more delicious the bread. And we sort of learned that by accident, because once we started milling, and the reason we started milling was that one of the bakers went to the States and did a stage he did a bunch of stages in North Carolina. He now has a bakery in Prague, beautiful bakery. I've never been, and he came back and was like, guys, the most delicious bread is made with freshly milled flour, so can we please buy a mill? And Ben was like, okay, let's do it. So we put a mill in, and that's the third iteration of the mill. The first one was quite small. And actually, I remember the day that it arrived. This particular one arrived, and it was just after I started. And it was a French man who made. Are you familiar with Astrier mills? Is anyone familiar with an Astrier mill? Yeah. Okay. Cool. So it's quite an old school style. It's very simple. It's quite rudimentary. It's sort of built with, it looks quite DIY. And you have the two granite stones, and one of them spins on the top, the other one kind of trickles, and then the grain kind of trickles through. And the day that it arrived, it was a French farmer, Samuel, who built the mill, and he drove it himself all the way across, and he didn't speak a word of English, but he was quite handsome. And so he turns up, and there's this energy in the bakery that's just like everybody's like buzzing of the excitement of this mill arriving. And I had only just started baking, so I didn't really know what was going on, but I could sense that like something really cool was happening. And so and then there he was in the backyard, redoing the grooves in the stone, and it was really cool. But yeah, so freshly milled flour makes the most delicious bread, we realized. So often the flour is milled the day before we put it into the dough. And because of the nature of the way the bakery works, we have quite a lot of people who work in more than one department, or we have some very special ones who do, because they tend to be very skilled. So one of the bakers is also a miller, so he does the milling shift, but he also delivers the bread. So sometimes he'll do a milling shift followed by a dough shift where you mix and shape and manage the fermentation, and followed by a bake shift where you bake all the bread, followed by a delivery shift, which is a really cool thing to do as a baker. Right, so that's that. So yeah, I guess in lots of ways, E5 Bakehouse it's a really exciting place to work as a baker, and partly because of this blank canvas of the grain world. So, for example, when we first started milling grain, we were having to buy direct from farmers because obviously grain is a commodity. So all the infrastructure that's in place is like to do with huge scales, like big trucks going onto big silos, going into big grain cleaners. So all of what happened has kind of come out of personal connections. And for the farmers among us, and for the people who work with farmers, you know that like it's all like verbal agreements often, and it just comes through a conversation, which I think is one of the sort of beauties of bread, and it comes back to community and the creativity that comes from people interacting, really. But one of the kind of like interesting things as well about working with heritage grains, and this is one of those ways in which the legislation sort of in some ways restricts what happens, but then also kind of opens up this subculture, is that because you're not legally allowed to trade heritage grains, then it means that farmers have to gift the grain. So all the grains that we now farm and mill and bake with, at some point was gifted to us by another farmer, and it may have been a handful. And actually, one of the grains that we worked with a lot was, and we're still growing it now, but not in such large quantities, is called Lizzie Parle, and it's from either Sweden or Denmark, but it was sent to us by a man called Fintan Keenan, who is another sort of really important figure who sort of works in, he's developing stone mills with roller mills kind of combined in one, which I think is really, really cool, interesting work. And so he was like, at the very beginning of our farming journey, he offered to send us some grain in the post, and he sent us 2 varieties of grain. And but he sent us Liz Brun by mistake, and the other one was Hollands, I think, if anybody's ever heard of Hollands. Yeah, he sent us Liz Brun by mistake, but we planted it, and we didn't know it was a mistake until later. And he was like, "Oh, I'm really sorry, I sent you that rubbish grain." We were like, "Yeah, but it's great. Like it's." And Liz Brun actually weirdly sort of was growing really beautifully in our soil, whereas in Denmark it was kind of rubbish. So yeah, there's something very exciting about working with a grain that's never been grown in English soil before, and sort of reinventing something that doesn't need reinventing, but by definition is a sort of reflection of tradition, really. So, does anyone have any questions about E5 so far? At all? Yeah.
What kind of soil do you have in South?
So the farm itself is in Suffolk. Which is sort of northeast. And I think it's quite sandy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you only did wheat, or?
No, we actually grow loads of things. Yeah, we grow like fruit and vegetables and herbs. It's a bit of a sort of experimental.
But within grains, only wheat, or also like spelt?
Only wheat. We've experimented with other things. We experimented with buckwheat. It didn't go that well. Partly because you need a special machine to dehull it. We've grown a little bit of rye, but we still haven't explored it that much.
And the cleaning?
We work with our neighbouring farmers, and yeah, there's a grain cleaning machine that we borrow. But to be honest, the first year or two, we weren't doing a very good job of cleaning the grains, and we were being sent this grain, and I was like, it was going into the mill, and I was like, this is not okay. We have to send it back. So yeah. Okay. Let me see. So let me just. So I guess I wanted to just talk a little bit about going back to the UK grain community and why I think it's kind of why it's exciting and some of the positives. And I think one of them is that we have a shared vision, really. And I think that one of the reasons we have that is partly because of things like this. They can be really galvanizing. Just having conversations about what motivates each other and what the challenges that we're facing are. No, it's fine. I think. Yeah, so I only have. I guess I got a few more slides. So a shared vision around, and I think, and I was sort of having conversations with a lot of the people that I know who work in the industry before I came, and I think the main common thread is tackling or facing the climate crisis, and I think one of the things that keeps us baking and keeps us delving more into farming is that when you're, one of the sort of beauties of bread is that because you're only dealing with a few different ingredients, that when you're buying flour, you're buying grain, you're buying quite a lot of one single ingredient. So in a way, you have the opportunity to shape the landscape. Even as a relatively small bakery, you're buying by the quarter ton, by the half ton, whatever. And so if you make those positive choices and you work closely with farmers to farm sustainably, then you really can see it in the landscape. And we're very lucky at E5 because we have a farm it used to be an arable farm. It wasn't organic, and it's not, the land isn't great, to be honest. We've really struggled to in a lot of ways. But the biodiversity that we now see, sort of, 8 years later, is really quite something. And the health of the soil has really changed, and I think that's very motivating. And I think another thing that characterises it is sort of the openness of bakers, and that's another thing because there aren't any secrets. Which, if you go to France, they might disagree. Because they tend to be quite guarded in France, in my experience. But we're only using 3 ingredients, sometimes 4, sometimes 5, sometimes a few more. But ultimately, it's there's nothing. There's magic, but there are no secrets. And I think another value we hold is a belief in food sovereignty, which I think is an interesting idea that sort of was amplified by COVID and by the war in Ukraine, because E5's been on this journey for quite a long time, and in relatively speaking, and so when there was a flour shortage and we still had access to grain and access to flour because we were growing it and we were milling it. And one of the things that I felt very strongly, and I'm sure all the bakers here, especially around bread, because everybody was suddenly so sort of focused on it and sort of obsessed with it and thinking about it, was that if you're a baker, you're probably never going to go hungry, and you're always going to be nourished with something worthwhile, and you'll always have something to feed your children. And I think in this sort of hyper-developed societies that we live in, we've forgotten the importance of just actually having enough food to eat, and that's a real reality for a lot of people in London, a lot of people in the UK. There are people going hungry, and that's kind of wild. And I think one of the ideas around accessibility and inclusivity that we were talking about in the previous conversation with Laurel was empowering people to learn how to make bread and to understand about where bread comes from and to understand what flour is, because actually loads of people just don't even really understand what flour is. And we don't, in the UK, we don't even have some of the language to describe it either. So yeah. And the other shared quality is probably ambition. I think the UK grain community is very, very ambitious in its scope. And also, I think anybody who's sort of engaged with trying to tackle the climate crisis, by definition, has to be quite ambitious in your outlook and in your approach. So yeah. So I guess what are some of the challenges still to face? The number one is the climate crisis, and how do we approach that? And I think something that came out of this summer's harvest was actually that, and I don't know what the weather was like here, but in the UK we had a quite hot spring, and June was really hot, and then it just rained, and it was cold. It was actually cold. It was horrendous for somebody who is not a farmer. And just as a normal person, it was just an awful summer. But for the wheat, it was problematic because it wasn't ripening properly. But something that we learned was that winter wheats were actually able to sustain the kind of fluctuation in weather patterns better than the spring wheats, because they had a longer window to grow. Maybe some of you don't know that wheat is normally divided into 2 groups. You have winter wheats that are sown in the winter and sit in the soil while it's cold, and then spring wheats that are planted in the spring. So that was one of the learnings. And then another sort of challenge is maintaining our integrity and focus in the face of greenwashing. Something that we've sort of seen where we are in the UK community is that, well, one thing is that we sort of splintered into groups, which was an active decision to try to keep hyper-local grain networks. So we have the East Anglian Grain Alliance, which is sort of London and the surrounding areas. Then we have the Southwest. So we've sort of divided into these groups, which in some ways is really positive. In other ways, it's maybe not so much. But yeah, so we've divided, but we've also seen a sort of shift into like bigger players coming in to the industry, which for sort of relatively small artisan bakeries, it doesn't feel like instinctively it doesn't feel right. But then you have to check yourself and be like, well, actually, is the bigger impact positive? And it's difficult. It's difficult to say whether it is. And Laurel mentioned something earlier about she in her previous talk, she was talking about the rise of sort of what she called fashion bakeries. And this is the sort of, I guess it's sort of bakeries that are based on a concept as in based on marketing. And I think that I'm very suspicious of like really over marketed bakeries, but it's very difficult to sort of distinguish between the two. And I think that's one of the challenges is like working out who. Ultimately, if you're in a starting point of collaboration, which I think is what we're always trying to do, yeah. But you still need to be able to work out who is greenwashing ultimately, because people are. Yeah. So I hope that sort of made sense. I know I tried to span quite a lot of different topics, but I wonder, maybe I could ask you guys some questions, and hit me with questions as well. There's a whole section which actually this is Louise, the managing director of E5 Bakehouse, teaching what's called the Not Just Bread program, which is a program where we teach people from refugee backgrounds how to make sourdough over a course of 8 or 10 weeks. And it's a program that we've been running since 2013, twice a year. And it really is a very important and central part of the type of work that we do in trying to make bread sourdough more accessible, trying to encourage inclusivity, trying to use education to sort of empower people. But I didn't go into that yet. But yeah, I wondered if anybody could answer the question or has any ideas around in what way you think the tradition of bread in Germany. Do you think that helps where you're trying to go, or do you think it sort of hinders it? Because I think from my perspective, I've always been sort of fascinated by those who do have a really strong bread culture, because we don't really in the UK, and it sort of seems cool, you know. It's like, because you have an understanding of what bread is in a way, in a different way to how we do in the UK. But I wonder if anybody had any ideas around that. What do you think? Yeah.
If I may, I have a counter question.
Go on.
Based on the workshops that you just
Yeah.
talked about. Because I'm not a baker myself, I'm not a bread maker myself, except for privately at home. But
Yeah.
I believe that bread culture is actually something that is global, right? And you have all these different cultural contexts from which people come from, or maybe because of industrialization and so on and so forth. It's a heritage that is forgotten, basically.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you're also able not only to teach those people, but to tap into their knowledge.
Yeah, totally. And
And how you feed off that, right?
Yeah, completely. Yeah, for sure. I mean, this the sort of one of the premises of this course is that it's an exchange of ideas, because often people come with so much energy, and a lot of it is just about being given a space, a safe space to sort of to express themselves and say, you know, this is my culture, and this is a recipe I learned from here, and sometimes people might not have a kitchen to be making stuff in, so they're just like, but yeah, it's totally an exchange of.
Because you have all those local yeasts, that kind of become forgotten. Because I mean, I'm quite. I know this the kind of food culture of Turkey, where actually, when sometimes it just becomes funny to me if I come as a German to Turkey and then people ask me about bread and praise my bread and my bread as a culture. But what I discover is that rather they forget about the heritage that they have, because they've been subject to exactly this industrial food culture that basically has introduced this terrible yeast to the market, and basically everyone at home started to use this rather than using the ferments and the cultures and the yeast that they have, and have had for generations. So, and I think that's true probably for every little corner of the world, right?
Yeah.
So I just wonder, if you're able to incorporate that.
Yeah, totally.
Knowledge.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm really interested in, and we were sort of talking about this a little bit before, about it's really important you have to be quite careful with your language around sort of yeasted breads and what this bread is better or this bread is because sort of putting those values on different breads. But I'm really interested in and this is something that we kind of practiced in this latest iteration of the Not Just Bread program, was that I was asking people to bring their recipes, and then we were adapting them to maybe not be fully sourdough, but be semi-sourdough. And so then we were kind of recipe writing together, and we made some really beautiful simit. And initially, so one of the participants was Aisha from Turkey, and she was a bit suspicious of this recipe that we'd kind of put together. But she got into it, and she was and it was cool, and we ended up making a little market stall and then selling them as products themselves. But yeah, I totally agree. It's an exchange for sure. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Not an answer about German.
That's fine. Yeah. No, you can say anything you like.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting, and you're a great speaker. I'm dying to know what you're up to next in the south of France.
Okay.
So maybe if you can answer that, would be lovely. And also, you said that the grain community, as you call it, is innovative and it's really open.
Yeah.
But for me, that's characteristics, and not per se. I would love to know why you think this is possible.
Yeah. Well, I think I know what you mean. But I do think that those characteristics, as you say, are also set as intentions. Mm-hmm. And each time we have like a grain gathering, there are certain figures in the grain community who I haven't mentioned yet. But for example, Kimberly Bell, who runs the grain lab, sort of having somebody who sets those intentions and vocalizes, like, what are we trying to do? What are we trying to achieve? Like, where are we going, and how do we get there, and what are the obstacles? And like, let's really pool our ideas together in this space and like use this moment. Because especially with farmers, because often people are so like tied to the land, right? So for people to come to a space like this and take that time out is really very special and precious. And so yeah, it's about setting intentions. And I think when you set an intention and you hold each other you have high expectations of the people around you, then, and you give them enough space to move into that space, then people quite often do,
So it's intentions and great facilitation. Or,
Pardon?
Intentions and great facilitation.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. I'd say so, yeah.
I was interested say, I mean, I've always, this is more of a process question, I guess, but like,
Yeah.
I've always experienced you as incredibly humble, but your food at railroad was so incredibly good. And what was that like to go to baking, which was, I suppose, relatively new for you?
Yeah.
Like, you know, did you feel sort of, you know, you immediately were successful at it and kept going? Or
No,
was it sort of
no. Actually, it's, well, sourdough in general, and all the sourdough bakers among us can probably agree that it's very humbling, because things like, because you can't, there's an element of letting go. You can't like control every bit. Whereas in maybe if you're a pastry chef or if you're a chef, it's a bit more about sort of control focused. Whereas to be a really good sourdough baker, you have to be like, okay, I'm going to guide you this way, but you're a living thing, so you know. So ultimately, it's very humbling anyway. But when I started, I you know what? For the first 2 weeks, I thought it was the most boring thing I'd ever done. And I was like, but there was something in my mind that was like, this is what I want to do. There was something in me that was like, I want to do this. I'm gonna do it, but fuck, it's boring. And then 2 weeks in, I was like, okay, I'm hooked. I'm done. Like, I got it. I get it. Like, I didn't understand it, but it was like, it got kind of under my skin. And I think there's something about fermentation and the where it kind of, and I use this like tortoise analogy, which stay with me because I hope it works. But I once moved into a friend's house. It was his family house, and he had these two tortoises, and they just go around. And when I first moved in, I was like, these tortoises are so boring, and they don't really do anything, and I don't really get it. And then like after a couple of weeks, I was like, okay, I get it. Because they're just on a different rhythm. They're doing their own thing, and it makes sense, and it's cool, and it's interesting, and I think it's very healthy to be able to lock in to that rhythm. And I think it's the same with the seasons. If you can lock into the seasons, if you can lock into the seasonality of vegetables, and it's the same with fermentation. Like, it's something outside of yourself that is really quite healthy to engage with. Yeah.
And what will you be doing in the south of France?
In the south of France, I'm going to go to Marseille, and I'm going to just work in a small bakery there. Because I think I'm still, there's a lot of, I'm still fascinated by France and what they have to teach me, I guess, because the French are very good at talking about ideas, but they're not afraid to intellectualize food. And I think in the UK we're a bit, it's taken us a long time to really value food, because it was just like, oh, it's just fuel, you know, whatever. Whereas in France it's held in quite high esteem, and I always sort of vibed with that, because I think that food is really important too. And I can talk about bread for days and days, as you can see. But yeah, so there's a lot of kind of interesting sort of where community meets food, meets art, work in France that I'm hoping to tap into. Yeah.
I have another question. So thank you at first for your insight to E5 and your personal development. So that was really lovely. I really enjoyed it. And I was wondering where you see the potential of such a project or business to be transferred to a larger scale.
Yeah.
As I understood, like, this project consists of connections, and that's something I can't really relate to on my step of the supply chain as a producer. Because we're producing a large scale, and we don't sell directly to the mills or clients or whatever. We're just in contact with the traders.
Yeah.
And I don't know. Where do you see maybe like an initial step that should happen to, I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think.
Inspire that concept.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and it's something I've asked myself loads of times. I was like, is it possible to make another E5 Bakehouse somewhere else? The short answer is no, it's not possible. But the long answer is that the reason why it works, I think, is that it's built on open-mindedness. And what I mean by that is like, and this is something that I recognize in all good sourdough bakers, and it's just a way of thinking, is that if you're shown a new idea or a new way of doing something that is sort of proves that the way you've been doing it up until this point was a bit rubbish, maybe, in order to take that new idea on and to change your process, you have to have a certain amount of humility, but you also have to. So you have to have a certain amount of humility, but also a certain amount of open-mindedness to be open to change, and to be open to ideas that are not your own. And if you're open to ideas that are not your own, that makes for a really beautiful work environment, and I think what makes for a really dynamic workspace where people feel valued and people are able to grow, and that people can feel nurtured and challenged at the same time. So I think that's a very vague answer, but more, I guess. I mean, I think the sort of conversations that happen between farmers and millers and bakers, and between farmers and bakers, and you can learn so much, and you can make a lot of connections that I think can lead in, if you're open about where it can lead, is a really good place to start. And also the other thing is, just baking. I mean, you already do that, don't you? Yeah, baking bread. Yeah.
Just ask a question.
Yeah.
When you decided to pick certain grain combinations, were there any selection criteria you applied?
Yeah, so we judged it by like aroma, and I think it was 1 to 5 in sort of how desirable or positive, I guess. So aroma, crust quality, color.
Is it bread or grain?
So that's after we milled and baked the. Yeah.
You pick the grains, like the ones that you.
We always do it that way. We always do it from the bread backwards. Does that make sense?
But does it also mean that you need to wait 1 year until you get the?
It's a long game, yeah. But we also have made bread with grain that like wasn't perfect. I've made so much bread with grain that wasn't perfect. And one of the things that we do is in our main dough we have four different flours. So we don't only use our own flour. Our own flour makes up about 60% of what we use, and most of that is grain that we've either grown ourselves or asked neighbouring farmers to grow for us. So we have agency over what variety is grown. But the other flours, we work with other mills who we've known for years and years. And that actually the relationship that we have with other millers is really, really important, because a lot of them, because when we first started milling, we had no idea what we were doing. And they were generous enough to come and like work with us for a couple of days and like show us how to do it. Or if we have a question, or so we have a very constant dialogue with these other millers as well. But they also bring different qualities to the bread itself. So we're playing with the recipe a lot. But we're still focused on stone ground, UK grown. Like those are the two main things. And then heritage varieties where possible. So I think at the moment we're about 70% long straw, which is not the same necessarily as heritage varieties. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
How much grain you process each year?
It varies a little bit, but it's about 70 tons. Yeah. Yeah. And and it,
Grown or in total?
I'd say about 60 tons of that is our own. Yeah. And it's normally it changes year to year, because we've been milling. We've been milling for about, I want to say 8 years. and then growing and milling for more like 6. So each year, like the first year where we were, the first year that YQ, for example, was gone, that population week that I was talking about was really sort of grown by a lot of different farmers. We were trying to support those farmers. So we were actually buying a lot of different grains into very small batches. So we were buying like a ton from this farmer, a couple of tons from that farmer. And that year, I think we milled and baked about 10 different varieties of YQ from different farms. And that's a really important part of the learning process as bakers, because then, and also for the farmers, so that we have those conversations about how was the wheat, how did it bake? And then one of the sort of coolest bits of the job is when the farmer drops off the grain and then you give them a loaf of bread made with the grain that they grew. And a lot of them have never, will have never eaten a bread like that with the grain they've grown. So it's quite fun. Yeah.
Just ask another question. Unfortunately, I've never been to London to visit E5.
Okay.
But could you maybe just the customer profile that you have in your shop? What kind of, is there like a way you could describe like the people that E5 attracts?
Yeah, it's changed a bit actually. At the weekend we have quite a lot of tourists. But it's in Hackney, and it's near to a very trendy bit of London. Basically, it's a very trendy bit of London. So it's sort of a lot of young professionals, a lot of people in the creative industry. Yeah, I'd say it. But that whole area is gentrifying a lot. So it's the customer base is more and more affluent, I think.
And do you feel that they really can relate to the idea of having your own grains, and is it something that they really value, or would they go after, let's say, sourdough as a trend?
Yeah, well, I think that's an interesting question, because within the last couple of years, the number of bakeries that have opened like almost on the same block as us, of sourdough bakeries baking very, very similar bread to us, is crazy. Like, it has the highest density of sourdough bakeries of anywhere I've ever been, actually. It's wild. And they're big. And like, not all of them are friendly either. So it's been really interesting seeing, because people have so much choice and the quality is pretty high. So I think the average customer is very discerning. Yeah, and very engaged in what we're doing. But one of the funky things about E5, and you'll recognize that as soon as you go, is that it's quite hard to know what's going on, because it is so fluid and there's so many projects happening, and we don't have a person working for PR. Like, we don't have a PR person, we don't have a marketing person. The person doing the Instagram posts is Louise, the managing director, and me when I was directing, and then a couple of other people, because we want it to be, it has to kind of come from the people who are doing the thing, who understand the thing, and it has to come from somewhere authentic. And that's, it's probably a bit flawed, and actually I don't really like Instagram that much, so it's kind of annoying, but yeah, so messaging is something that we're constantly rethinking, but then simultaneously not really wanting to spend too much time on it, because if it's over polished, if it's over marketed, you're kind of ruining it. And from the conversation that we had before with Laurel, like she was talking about how a business kind of reflects the owner, like how a small business can reflect the owner, and how the products that are baked can and often do reflect the owner. And I think the way Ben, the founder of E5, would describe E5 is that it's like a conversation between the customer, the product, the people working there, and then the community around the bakery who don't even walk through the door. And so it is this kind of interactive thing, which I think is why bread is such a cool place to start. Because if you start with something really simple that people recognize, and then you build out and allow enough space and enough fluidity for people to kind of have an impact on that space. And I think when people walk into E5, it takes you a minute. It takes you way longer than a minute to work out what's going on, because there's like, even for the people who work there's so much happening, and that's one of the beauties of it, because it sort of pulls you in, and you're like, oh, this seems interesting over here. And it's like, and it's not all signposted, and it does sort of, and it's ultimately it's a conversation. Yeah. More questions?
Only think about it, because since I'm living on the countryside,
Yeah.
I see it would be much more easier to, maybe it's not that easy to find people who are like you and E5 Bakery, like work there,
Yeah.
but to grow this kind of with the farmers and everything, it just would be easier, and it's more grounded, it's not that fancy, the community really is sometimes, they need it.
Yeah.
And I like that energy, like it's really about the community, and they know the farmer and everything.
Yeah.
So when you go out of the city, you can, like, it's a different thing than in Berlin, for example, or London.
Yeah.
And I recognize that in the next village there could be another baker the same as me. It would be completely okay, and the next one another small one. So I like it small, and I think to scale it up too big, it doesn't make sense because the people don't relate to it anymore.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually, because I was going to say that, like, looking forward and thinking about the vision of how I would hope that, at least in the UK, like going forward, what's the dream? And the dream is to have like loads of different bakeries, loads of different mills, and all those different bakeries would be different, and they'd reflect the people working there, and they'd reflect their local community, and they'd reflect it in the products that they're making, and the space that it is, and how it feels, and like real diversity, and like just loads of them.
Yeah.
Really, really cool.
Everyone does his own experiences and bring that in.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
It's a bit what we have already with breweries.
Pardon?
It's a bit what we have with breweries already. That's what I experienced in the UK.
What?
Breweries.
Oh, breweries.
Since you have a lot of local.
Yeah, true. Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, totally. And actually, one of the things that I remember seeing a craft brewer from the States speak years ago, and he was talking about how the craft brewing scene, because it's so huge in the States, has just completely transformed the landscape in a positive way. And I was just like, whoa, that's really cool. And it sort of filled me with optimism for what bread can do. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think the future's bright. Yeah. Great. How are you doing for time? Is it? Okay.